Welcome to the Explainer. So picture this. It's the late 4th century BCE, in a vast, heavily fragmented ancient India. Storm clouds are literally gathering. Alexander the Great's legions have just fractured the northwest, leaving this massive power vacuum, right? And meanwhile, the east is just suffocating under the tyrannical grip of the Nanda dynasty. But out of this absolute chaos steps a brilliant and honestly ruthless strategist who's going to forge the first pan-Indian empire. His name? Kautilya, also known as Chanakya. Today, we're decoding his ultimate playbook. Okay, let's dive into this. Basically, Kautilya's entire worldview can be summed up by this one core belief. You absolutely cannot have a happy, ethical society, what he calls dharma, without a solid foundation of material wealth, which he called artha. And guess what? You can't have material wealth without incredibly strong, practical, and highly organized governance. For Kautilya, statecraft wasn't just some abstract philosophy to debate. No, it was the absolute bedrock of human survival and prosperity.
To really understand how we pulled this off, we've got to rewind to 325 BCE. Alexander the Great is retreating from the Punjab, and the region is totally destabilized. Now, most people just saw chaos, but Kautilya, he saw a massive geopolitical opening. He essentially took a young, exiled man named Chandragupta Maurya under his wing, mentored him in warfare and governance, and boom, by 321 BCE, they completely overthrew the corrupt Nanda dynasty. And within just a few decades, they managed to unite most of the Indian subcontinent into one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever seen.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the spark of vengeance that kicked it all off, uncover his master manual of power, break down his anatomy of the state, explore his vast shadow network of spies, map out his geopolitical game board, and finally, look at why his ancient strategies are still profoundly relevant today.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Vengeance and the Maurya Empire, the catalyst of a dynasty.
You know, the foundation of India's greatest ancient empire didn't actually start in some sterile war room. It started with a deeply, deeply personal grudge. Historical texts tell us that Kautilya, who was a learned Brahmin, traveled to the Nanda capital seeking recognition. But instead of being welcomed, he was publicly insulted by the king and literally thrown out of the court. So furious, Kautilya dramatically unties his hairlock, his shikha, and swears this solemn vow. He would never tie it back up until the entire Nanda dynasty was completely eradicated. I mean, talk about a dramatic catalyst, right? It was this raw human spark of vengeance that ignited his unparalleled strategic genius.
All right, moving on to Section 2, the Arthashastra, Kautilya's blueprint of power and the science of material gain.
Now, let's open up the metaphorical, glowing manuscript that Kautilya wrote to ensure his brand new empire would survive. And what's truly fascinating here is just the sheer scope of this text. The Arthashastra translates roughly to the science of material gain, or political economy. See, Kautilya wasn't just writing about lofty morals or ideals. He was writing a hyper-rational, completely unsentimental manual on how a king should actually acquire, maintain, and expand power. We're talking about a comprehensive guide to literally everything, from trade and taxes to diplomacy and, yes, covert assassinations.
What made Kautilya so unique was how he integrated 4 distinct fields of knowledge to run a state. He recognized the Vedas for ethics and Anvikshaki or philosophy as the light guiding all reasoning. But crucially, he treated the science of government and Vartha, which covers economics, agriculture, and trade, as deeply intertwined. They weren't separate things to him. He knew that a state's military power rests entirely on its economic health. I mean, it's simple math. You absolutely cannot conquer your enemies if you can't feed your people or fund your treasury.
That brings us to Section 3, the Saptanga Theory, the 7 limbs of state, or the anatomy of power.
This is where Kautilya breaks down the internal mechanics of how an empire actually functions on a day-to-day basis. To Kautilya, a state isn't just a king sitting on a throne claiming a piece of land. No, he developed the Saptanga Theory. This defined the state as an organic, living body made up of 7 distinct but fully interdependent limbs, or elements. And what's crazy is that he preceded Western political thought by centuries in recognizing that a nation functions exactly like a biological organism. Let's look at these 7 elements. First, you have the Swami, the central brain or the ruler. Then, the Amacha, the nervous system made up of ministers and bureaucracy. The Janapada is the physical body, the territory, and the people. Durga provides the skeletal defense, like fortifications. Kosha is the lifeblood, the treasury. Danda is the muscle, the army itself. And finally, Mitra, the allies, which extend the body's reach. Kautilya argued that a weakness in literally any single one of these limbs, say an empty treasury, immediately starves the army and ultimately paralyzes the king. And this brilliantly illustrates Kautilya's core belief in functional interdependence. Think of the state like a magnificent royal chariot. If a single wheel is cracked or an axle is broken, the entire machine is going to falter in battle. Every single part has to serve and support the others for the empire to actually thrive and expand.
Okay, moving into the shadows now with Section 4, Gura Purusha, the shadow network, or the eyes and ears of the king.
So how exactly do you protect a population of 50 million people from internal and external threats? Well, you use the Gura Purusha, the hidden men. Kautilya viewed espionage not as some dirty, dishonorable trick, but as a fundamental, institutional pillar of governance. In fact, he placed the intelligence network on the exact same level of importance as the royal treasury or the military. To him, trying to govern an empire without panoptic, omnipresent information was practically a death sentence.
The crucial point here is how brilliantly organized this spy network was. It was basically split into two main branches. On one side, you had the Sanstha, the stationary spies. These agents really put down roots. They blended into local society, built deep trust over years, and acted as intelligence hubs to detect subtle shifts in public mood or catch civil service corruption. On the flip side, you had the Sanchara, the wandering spies. These were the highly mobile and honestly highly dangerous operatives deployed for active disruption, delivering messages and executing aggressive covert ops.
The gritty reality of these spy covers is just fascinating. I mean, Kautilya's spies were absolute masters of disguise. You had the Kapataka posing as a student mingling in taverns, just eavesdropping on dissidents. Or the Vaideheka acting as a merchant to monitor trade and catch tax-evading officials. But maybe the most interesting is the Tapasa, the ascetic monk. Because religious figures had immense authority back then, Kautilya used them to predict fake calamities just to terrify superstitious enemies. And then, lurking in the dark corners, were the Rasada, the poisoners, quietly slipping toxins into rival ministers' wine. Information gathering, psychological warfare, targeted eliminations, the whole shebang was meticulously categorized.
Let's pan out for Section 5, Mandala, the Circle of States and Kautilya's geopolitical game board.
We've looked inside the empire, so now let's shift our focus outward to the geopolitical matrix, viewing the world exactly as Kautilya did. He called this the Rajamandala, or the Circle of States. It's a hyper-rational, deeply calculating geometric theory of foreign policy. And listen to this. Kautilya completely rejected moral obligations in international relations. Instead, he firmly believed that foreign policy is driven purely by national self-interest and geographic proximity. For him, survival demands constant, unemotional calculation.
This geometric matrix builds into a ruthlessly pragmatic strategy. The core axiom here is super simple. Geography shapes hostility. At the center, you have the Vijagishu, the ambitious state seeking supremacy. The state immediately bordering you, that's the Eri, your natural enemy, simply because shared borders inevitably mean competition over land, water, and trade. But the state bordering your enemy? Well, that is the Mitra, your natural ally. Yep, this is the ancient structural origin of the famous phrase, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend."
12. That's the number of primary king types in Kautilya's concentric geopolitical grid. He didn't just map out friends and foes. He actually categorized neutral buffers, mediating states, and rear enemies across 12 distinct geopolitical profiles. It represents an incredibly nuanced view of ancient diplomacy. It allowed a ruler to basically anticipate the shifting balance of power across the entire region before it even happened.
And this geopolitical mapping feeds directly into how Kautilya waged war. He always favored flexibility and efficiency over brute force. Actually, Kautilya famously calculated that open warfare was just too costly and unpredictable. Oftentimes, sending a single undercover assassin into an enemy's camp, or using spies to plant rumors that divide an enemy's leadership, was vastly more efficient than risking 10,000 soldiers on a battlefield. It really is the absolute pinnacle of strategic realism.
Finally, Section 6, the timelessness of Kautilya, applying ancient strategy in a modern world.
Let's bring these ancient concepts out of the Mauryan era and directly into our modern geopolitical landscape. Because even though the Arthashastra was written over 2 millennia ago, its logic basically still governs how modern nations operate today. I mean, modern intelligence agencies still rely heavily on Kautilya's principle of rigorous verification before taking action. Nations still balance power by cultivating regional alliances. Just look at the defensive pacts formed around the globe today to counter bordering rivals. And his insistence on using internal watchdogs to hold the bureaucracy accountable, that's the exact precursor to modern anti-corruption systems. The tools have certainly changed, but the fundamental human nature of power, not at all.
Which brings us to our final thought. Look at a map of the world today. Look at the shifting alliances, the border disputes, the silent intelligence wars being fought in the shadows. If we took Kautilya's ancient geopolitical blueprint and mapped today's major global powers onto his concentric circles of allies and enemies, are we still living inside the Mandala? It's a pretty fascinating lens to view our world through. Thank you for joining this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the map around you.